So, hello, Pavi, and thank you for the third conversation that we have about Adlerian psychology and philosophy. So we had two conversations already in the past weeks. I think they were very beneficial, and I think we kind of rediscovered how some of the attitudes that we all know very well in everyday psychology actually were rooted partly in what Adler kind of did. To be very present, to be very pragmatic, to kind of see oneself as someone who has equal opportunities and that I should not hold myself back because of my background, and that I should see the potential that I have and actualize it as much as possible. So many of these things of positive psychology are rooted in Adlerian thoughts, who, as I mentioned in the introductions of the previous conversations, was kind of known to be very pragmatic and by far not as intellectual and kind of theoretical as, for example, one of his teachers, Freud, used to be. So he made a point out of it, partly because he was very interested in parenting and child rearing. And one of his attitudes was quite obviously that he wanted to be pragmatic and to deliver kind of simple messages to people to relate to. And he was not as elitist as Freud often was with his very demanding concepts. So today we come to our third and probably final conversation about Adlerian psychology. And we picked two topics that we hope to get into during our conversation. We think that both are very relevant for psychology today and for things that people struggle with actually in everyday life, with some attitudes that seem good and that we know about, but are difficult to implement. So yes, why don't we start, and why don't you give us an introduction of the Adlerian perspective of the first topic?
Absolutely. So Doc, today I wanted to talk about the concept around how we view situations in our life. And according to Adler, basically, if we have any situation in life, whether something bad happens at work, whether our parents, mistreat us or our partner mistreats us, most of us always fall into two sides of this, thinking. And one of them is that bad person. As in, that bad person did this to me, they were bad to me, and because of them, I'm unable to be successful at work. Because of them, I have such bad habits because of my parents. So essentially comes down to that bad person.
So I'm a victim of people and circumstances, of other people.
Exactly.
And circumstances. I'm a victim.
Yeah. And when there's no particular person that we want to target at, the mentality becomes poor me. So poor me, I just had like such, I grew up in such a bad background. I grew up in India. I didn't grow up in US. I didn't have the luck. I have such bad luck, etc. And he said that what you need to do is sort of go away from both of these situations and just go into what now? What do I do now? Disregard, any hurt feelings. Forget about whatever happened to you.
Yes.
Just tell me, just think about what do you want to do now? And this is something that a lot of, all these motivation stickers and all that talk about. But when it comes to applying, I think that is where the challenge becomes, because how do you, if you are going through a very tough situation, how do you just like switch your mind immediately and say, okay, what now? You do have some self-pity. There are circumstances in which, it's just luck is not on your side, and you do fall into that poor me mentality. yes, you can't do anything about it, but it's very hard to make that shift unless, you know, unless you're just like taught to do that, or you know that. So
Mm.
I wanted to discuss that with you today.
Yes. So first of all, I think it's good to acknowledge, as you say, that this kind of advice, the get over it, don't be too emotional about it, try to objectively look at the situation, what are the goals that you want to achieve, and kind of direct your actions according to your goals, not to the past hurt that you experienced. We can even include kind of the mindfulness movement at large in this way, so that we disconnect our emotions from the objective situation, which then helps me to see the situation clearer and to fulfill my goals. So it's the everyday knowledge that many people have, particularly when they kind of a little bit interested in coaching, motivation, self-development, is infused with this kind of thinking. So I'm not sure exactly if this started entirely only with Adler, but this way of thinking surely had a very successful career, so that many people know about this. Also, I think without question, if people are able to implement it, it helps them. So the
Yep.
usefulness, I think, of this kind of thinking is, especially in our life and in societies that fetishize effectiveness, it's quite helpful, right? So maybe people who are super interested in the depth of their mind and they don't want to brush over emotions and so on, they would be critical of something like that. You know, they would say, I want to know it's important to look at the feelings and so on, which surely many people have, but especially in workforce, I would say that it's quite easy to agree with such a sentiment.
Yet, on the other hand, the way I was thinking was, you know, in any situation, if you just say, okay, you know what, this situation happened, let me just go forget about everything else, I just need to move on, you're also not assimilating any of the lessons that happened, right? So if when you are in that bad person did this to me, or poor me, I'm also reminding or teaching myself to say, okay, if this at work, if this kind of person or this personality, when I meet them next, because you know you do end up meeting similar people,
Yeah.
I'm going to remind myself, if I don't I'm going to remind myself that this, you know, that to be aware or to be cautious. But if you just like move past it quickly, to me it just means that you haven't really learned any lessons. And I see that a little bit, like, you know, with my parents, for example, like anything will happen to them, they'll be like, alrighty, oh well, this happened, let's just figure out what to do next. But they will not step back and say, what were my lessons from it, what did I wanted to learn. They'll just keep moving past it.
Yeah.
And maybe it works for them, but I feel they make the same kind of mistakes with different family members. To give you an example, my parents will allow some random far-fetched family member to come and stay with them, and inevitably they'll come and stay for like months on end, right? Like 3-6 months, because they've got a job in town or something to that effect. Eventually the situation almost leads into that relationship between my parents and this family member will devolve enough that they will eventually move out, because they haven't, you know, they don't learn the lesson of, okay, let's talk about how long are you going to be here, are you going to pay for your food, these
Yes.
are our timings, are you going to adhere to our schedule. And then 2 years later another family member would request and they'll be like, yeah, we like this one. And the same cycle repeats. And I feel like they every single time it happens, they're just like, okay, what do we do now, how do we fix this situation? But they never step back in retrospect. And the only time you end up retrospecting is when you stay in that place of that bad person or poor me, or that bad person, and that's how you move on, right? So
Okay, so how would you feel if so it's a very simple message. move
Mm-hmm.
on, right? Forget about the past,
Yeah.
move on, the
Yeah.
very simple Adlerian thing. How would you feel about an adjusted version, which is see what went bad, learn
Mm-hmm.
from it, move on? So to have this intermediary step, but still with this very strong pragmatic push. Okay, you made a mistake, something went wrong. What was it?
Mm-hmm.
How can you avoid it in the future? And then move on.
Even in that, I think like in some cases you're able to do it when the, you know, when the hurt isn't that bad, or in this previous example.
Hmm.
But in other situations, it's frustrating or it's tiring to, you know, you do want to have a little bit of that pity party, and feel sorry for yourself.
Yes.
And I think like Adler doesn't really give us any space to do that. And I
Mhm.
do feel that, you know, there is some healing or something that comes from, you know, feeling a little bit sorry for yourself, or there is, you do need that space, right? As a child, if your parents abused you,
Hmm.
now you've grown up, you still feel sorry for that child who ended up going through some serious abuse, whether it's physical or mental.
Yeah.
And how can you just be like, it comes back to Adler saying, oh, the past does not matter,
Mhm.
and you just need to move past it. To me, if you do not really process or grieve with that child, you are not going to really, you know, you're just putting all your emotions inside and then just like moving past it because that's what you're supposed to do. And
Okay.
that's what Adler's advocating you to
Yes.
do.
Let me play a little bit Adler's advocate here, not the devil's.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe we've all just internalized a Freudian position, basically, which would be we became oversensitive to these internal processes. We fell in
Mhm.
love with them. And we love the idea of wallowing in the mud, of self-pity, of self-referential processing, you know, kind of looking at myself and my feelings, my hurt, my this, my that. And that it became kind of a social, cultural staple, you know, that we kind of have, we think that this is how it's supposed to be and that this is the healthy thing. And there's a culturally shared idea of how long this kind of process is supposed to take. For example, like mourning, right?
Mhm.
When someone passes away, it's not written anywhere, but there is kind of an idea of how long people should mourn and from when it starts to be unhealthy. So when people mourn for 1 or 2 years for the parents or a partner that died, like most people would say, okay, I think it's time to move on. Don't you think that it's time to see other people and something like that, right? Whereas
Right.
after a week, nobody would say that. So
Mhm.
there's some spectrum there. And maybe we have acquired with time, with all those decades that we are exposed to psychological processing and psychoanalysis, maybe we acquired some spectrum of uh, introspection that we feel is healthy and that we have a resistance, not because of reality, but because of this shared idea, a resistance against moving on too quickly, a little bit like in mourning. So
Mhm.
someone comes to me, you know, as a psychologist, and they say, I want to process my past. And then I would too quickly move on and say, look, it's more important what you want to be in the future and who you want to be in the future. It's ultimately, everyone experiences bad things in their life. It's just not good to wallow too much and to self-reflect too much. So what would you say about that? How did you distinguish if that's a belief that you hold on to about that it's good to reflect upon this inner child, or if it's a psychological reality that is, you know, not culturally dependent?
Um, I I I think um, there is some you do need to process, and you do need to acknowledge what had happened. And I do hear that at some point you do need to move on, right? I cannot be at 50, having moved out of my parents' house at 17 and still be blaming my parents, right? Like, I know people who still do
They
that.
do, yes.
Yeah. And to them, I just say, okay, you need to process and sort of like move on. But for example, for me, when I came to you, I think almost like 2.5 years ago, for me, I had not processed sort of like, the hurt that I had felt with regards to my father's problems. And to me, it did help me sort of like, once I acknowledged that, yes, I was hurt, and it's not just me feeling angry without any reason towards my father, it did help me sort of move on. So maybe it takes some people 30, 40 years to process that kind of grief. And maybe it's unhealthy because they still haven't had, the damage was that much, right? Like if a child has been sold into sexual trafficking by their parents for the first 15 years of their life, maybe the damage is that much that, it'll take them the entire lifetime. So who are we to then say?
Yes, or a simpler example, not so drastic. There are a good number of people who grew up with not so much love. They're not shown physical affection. They are not hugged as kids. They're not kissed as kids. They're not encouraged as kids. They're just used in a very kind of cold, distant way, and they never understood why, and it leaves them somehow with problems. And as adults, they might have difficulties to relate to other people and to build a relationship and to love their children in a way, because they don't know exactly what that would mean. So, and I think the number of those people is relatively large, depending on what our parents kind of went through. Parents and grandparents. We still have grandparents who experienced war or post-war situations that were very rough, right? Where it was just about physical survival, and where in many cases they did not know anymore how to love. It was just a rough time. And that went on to our parents' generation and also to our generation. So there are people who experience that. Well, my response would be, for now, actually, so going back to the beginning, what I said, that a lot of Adlerian thought is very present in our everyday culture. And we have many, many people who are not interested in emotion, not interested in processing, and who actually live by this principles, like, just get over it.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in your emotion. I'm not interested in my emotions. I just want to pursue my goals and be pragmatic and effective, because all the rest is just psychological blah blah and bullshit, and it's what women do, or it's what wussies do, or like, there's a strong notion of this.
Absolutely,
I don't know numbers or anything, but maybe 20-30% of people think like that. It's not very rare. Okay, and here's my point is, it doesn't work. It does not work. That would be my main argument. So those, not everyone, I'm not saying that it doesn't work entirely, but a good number of these people, they hit a wall with this, either within themselves, so that they get into a depression and they don't know why and they don't know how, and they have no tools whatsoever of how to deal with that. Or, life situations change and they come into the midlife and suddenly they have no idea of what to do themselves. And they want to continue to be pragmatic and just pursue their goals, but suddenly they don't know anymore what their goals are. So that with all this moving on, not processing, they have not developed a kind of a perspective of depth within themselves. And then they're kind of helpless because they have not acquired tools to deal with themselves and situations. So this is one kind of wall. Another kind of wall is that, okay, maybe I continue to be like this, the moving on, being pragmatic, being objective, and so on, but more and more people in my surrounding cannot relate to that anymore. So
Yeah.
if that is maybe kind of the typically cliche kind of male engineering kind of attitude, and the partner would have a lot of difficulties. They would just like, I cannot live like this, to pretend that nothing happened and we didn't have a big argument last week or something. You just want to move on, and I feel like, hey, wait a minute, this is I don't know who you are anymore. This kind of thing. So either I hit a wall with myself or I hit a wall with other people. Again, not saying that everyone experiences this, but I experience it often enough to see that this is a particular danger with this kind of approach.
Right. Yeah. I think I kind of agree with you. It's like you do need some kind of time to like sort of process, and rather than immediately saying, okay, that bad person or poor me, or like staying in that situation does help you sort of process it, and then you need to move, otherwise you'll just hit one of these walls, either like you become the person who doesn't know anything about their own internal emotions, or you can't relate to anybody in your surroundings anymore, and you have that like that masculine, or not. I even see it in females. I think I was like that for a while. Where I would be like, okay, let's just move past, let's just figure out what needs to be done, and we'll move and do it.
So maybe you can describe in general terms, not go into specifics, but how was it for you when, I mean, you're still, you like to be a pragmatic person, right? So that's something that is just your work ethos and a general principle of yours. You like to kind of find out what's the right thing to do and then to implement it, right? So that's a favorite process of yours. And then with time, over the past years, you implemented more kind of processing tools and more processing perspectives. What was the major advantage for you, or the benefit of that, that in contrast, the pure kind of pragmatic perspective could not provide?
So I think I have become more present, right? Like in the past 2 years, I've become a little bit more present with my inner state, and that has sort of brought in a little bit more calmness only lately. And the other thing that did happen was, as I've started working with you, it's become easier to connect or empathize with other people. So I was one of those people, right? Like, who was like, let's move fast, right? Like marching on. So as I started to slow down and say, okay, let me process what had happened, I am able to feel my emotions, rather than, I used to have a fairly binary emotions, right? Like it was either crying or totally happy, world is a good place, let's move to the next project. And I can plan my way through everything, was my sort of life motto, almost. And working with you, stopping to sort of process that internal turmoil, it helped me become, number one, more empathetic to the people around me. So now I've built more closer friendships with a whole bunch of people, rather than just like one or two who I thought were very much like me. Previously I could only get along well with my partner, who's very much like me, and then like one or two of my friends who are fairly similar personality. But now I've sort of started to build deeper relationships with a bigger set of people. So that is sort of that external thing that happened. And I think that happened because there was a step in between where I had to process my emotions, and I became more cognizant of what's going on. The second was
Mhm.
obviously the emotions, right? Like I'm still learning to recognize, like, the different emotions rather than just anger or irritation and then totally fine. Now I'm like, okay, I'm in an okay mood, or I'm irritated by this, or I find this particular thing annoying, but I can move past. Like, you start to build that bigger spectrum of emotions.
And why is that good? Why is that of value? Why is that not a wussy thing? Okay, great. So now instead of 3 emotions, 50. So what?
um, I think it gives you a little bit um, more satisfaction, right? Like throughout your life, right? Through the different aspects of your life.
Hmm.
Um, and and it sort of again comes back to the same thing, right? You're able to empathize with different people, with different situations and scenarios. Um, you get that little bit more of a the connection with other people. I would say
Mhm.
that would be the biggest thing. And you get to internally, you get to recognize what are your needs and wants, and you're able to honor them as opposed to just sort of push past,
Hmm.
you know the things that you need to.
Okay,
I
so
don't
this
know,
is
you tell me, Doc. You're the one who's been working with me.
well, you touched there a very important point with this, which is the needs and wants. I'm still interested in a little bit in something that you said before with the empathy and understanding other people. So it seems that because we mentioned this formula of processing a lot in this conversation now, so to process what happened, to process my feelings, and it's a mysterious word. Like, what is
Yeah.
that to process? If people have not gone through that, it might sound mysterious or off-putting depending on where I stand. If I think, oh, that's all just crap, right? Endless talking about nothing. Like, what is the outcome of that?
Hmm.
And I think you gave us a hint of how you could translate the word, which is basically to gain the skill of understanding myself and others better.
Yeah.
And that this is that as a direct result of this, I can empathize more with other people, and that allows me to have stronger bonds with them. When
Hmm.
when I see that in our conversation that you understand where I'm coming from, I immediately feel more connected to you, and I feel more interested to have another conversation with you, and I feel I have kind of those friendly feelings. So I think this can be easily seen how the ability to understand people and to read them a little bit better leads to is basically equivalent with empathy and leads to stronger interpersonal bonds. And that I think we can assume that people understand that this is a source of satisfaction in life. It makes me feel less isolated, right? If we go to the extreme, there are times when we feel really bad, when we have a depressed state of mind, and we feel very, very disconnected in these situations. We don't believe that others can understand us. We are kind of cold and distant from other people in these states, and that just feels bad.
Hmm.
That is not a good mindset or not a good feeling. And the opposite, when I feel connected, that even when I feel bad, I know that I can call a friend. This friend has a good track record and understanding me and empathizing with me. And then I feel less disconnected and I feel better. So this is, I
Yeah.
think, kind of sequence that makes sense. That processing in the sense of understanding myself and understanding others through reflection, through kind of consciously chewing through some situations. For example, my boss yelled at me, I felt hurt, right? And then to
Hmm.
to kind of make the effort of thinking, okay, what do you think went on in your boss's mind? What are, not that we can mind read, but what are
Yeah.
possibilities why he yelled at you? And then instead of kind of vilifying the other person who caused me harm, I'm forced into a position of, okay, good. So yes, I don't want to, but let me think if there's something that I can understand there.
Hmm.
Maybe he had a bad day. Maybe he wasn't happy with the course of the company. Maybe he's worried about debt. Maybe he's that. Maybe he's this. Maybe he's this. So maybe he's still an asshole. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something more legitimate than this. So next time I see that person, these kind of conversations are still in my mind somehow in the background, and I'm not so easy to just label him as the bad guy. And there's something in me that reaches out a little bit more, or tries to check if the conversations that I had, if that kind of pans out, and if there's some validity to it. So this is this processing / understanding myself and others. I think that understanding myself is more complex as a process as understanding others. And here I think this is where it comes in, what you finished off with, what I said was very important, which is to understand my needs and wants.
Yeah.
So if I too quickly move on and I say, okay, let me just go back to the things that I wanted. Well, what is this? Right? If I didn't take the time and the effort to check if the goals that I had 5 years ago, when, for example, I started my professional career, if those are still the same, if I don't stop and think about it in various ways, we can say process it or understand myself, what am I left with? I'm left with the goals that I had previously. What else could it be? Or there's some magical way in which I intuit automatically what is right for me now. I don't think that exceptionally, yes, some people seem to have this talent. Many and most people, I would say, have not. So when you tell them, don't think about it, don't process it, what hurt you or why you are in a midlife crisis, just move on. Just go on to pursue the same goals that you had previously. There's obviously something wrong in that, because I think most of us know through experience that throughout life situations and when we mature and we step into different periods of our life, that also our goals change. As teenagers, obviously, we want something else. As students, we want something else. As young professionals, we want something else. And when we have a family, a partner, maybe kids, we want something very different again. So how else can I do it than to think about it and to reflect on it and to, might say, process in order to understand myself? So it's not enough, again, I think for most people, to say, just move on.
Yeah. Yet, like you mentioned yourself, the Freudian thought process is like, you just sort of like keep sitting on it too, right? Like
Yes.
Freud just wants you to continue sort of thinking about it, feeling about it, and
The endless introspection.
the endless introspection, and not just the endless introspection, it is giving into giving in and saying what the past happened and this is who you are, and now you're sort of like forever stuck in it, right? So I think like I see that both schools have merit in it, and I think Freud just went the entire other way of just like, okay, now what has happened, and this is who you've just become, and you never really change.
Yes. Which he didn't say, by the way. I think he's very misunderstood. But yes, like there is the when we take the process of psychoanalysis, for sure. I mean, you know a little bit how I work. I aim at kind of sporadic conversations, meetings every week or maybe every 2 weeks for a couple of sessions. If it's an acute issue, but I don't like kind of the super long-term therapy. It eventually turns into coaching and kind of friendly reflections, something like that. A psychoanalysis is easily for 2-3 years and meet each week 3 times a week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That is not an uncommon psychoanalysis, sometimes 4 times a week, which is a crazy amount of introspection and reflection and work that I feel maybe there was a time when it was historically kind of necessary to go through this for culture, kind of to learn and implement all those different perspectives. I think it's not adequate at all anymore. Far, far, far too much for a contemporary person to do this kind of exaggerated introspection, in my mind. So this would be, this is kind of the Freudian psychoanalysis approach.
Okay.
Where you live less than you introspect. And then for me, the balance is off. There should be much more living and trying and doing things, thinking on my own, spending time with friends, than the introspection or the therapy, which should be a help or a support, but not really a main part of life for a longer time.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, when I started coming to you, I think I was coming like once a week or once every 2 weeks. And to me, even that was like somebody who was very pragmatic, very very structured. It was very tiring to talk to you for an hour about whatever was going on. And I used to be exhausted afterwards. I can't imagine like 4 hours a week.
Yes.
I'll have to take the time off from work entirely. Okay, so how would, for your listeners, and how would you, if someone doesn't have the skills to process, right? Like, what can they build that skill set of processing their emotions or figuring out, get in touch with their thoughts and emotions, right?
Yes.
What is there any particular like process or steps or something that you would recommend? Obviously, Adler just thinks you should just move past it. But, sort of like merging both the Freud and the Adler, right? Processing a bit and then trying to figure out where do you want to go from there? What would your process be like?
Well, maybe I can distinguish two contexts. So one, I can relate to how I would usually work with people, and then maybe a more general approach for people who don't necessarily have a coach or a therapist. So what can people do on their own? The way that I work, for me, often it's what we kind of find out in our sessions are working hypotheses. I have a very flexible idea of what the truth is. Sometimes we find a truth that is valid for now only, but cannot be maintained, as this is you or this is your truth for, the next decades or so. What I mean with that is we do some introspection, we do process and try to understand a situation, for example, that caused the problem. So I had this major argument with my parents, maybe. And after that, I couldn't sleep for 3 days and I wanted to move on, right? Because everyone wants to go back to work and not to think about those silly conversations, but I couldn't. I could not sleep well. Some things popped up into my mind and it brought back memories that I was not treated well by my parents. So I think many people can relate to this. I wanted to let it go.
That tape keeps playing in your head.
Yes. So then what my process would be is to start reflecting on it and to dig up some examples, right? For example, of what went wrong in the past. What are my fantasies of what I would like to do, right? And here I already try to connect with a need in its more crude form. I would like to tell them off, for example.
Yeah.
Right? And then my question would be, okay, what would be satisfactory about that? Oh, because I would be the powerful one, for example. I'm just making up an example. So finally, I could switch it around, and where usually I am the powerless and I'm told what to do, and they're keeping their cool, I could be the one to tell them what to do. That would be so good. And then obviously there's a theme of powerlessness and power there. That gives us some more material to discuss. Okay, does that represent your life? They might say, yes, sometimes at work, when my bosses talk to me, I feel the same way. Or they say, no, the crazy thing is that exactly the contrast. I do have a life where I don't feel powerless. I have a good relationship with my bosses, or I'm a boss myself. It's only when I go to my parents that I feel like a child again. And so we come to different themes then. So we peel away some layers, and eventually we get some understanding of what it is all about, right? Is it about power? Is it about maturing? Is it about establishing a new relationship with my parents? And here we come to the practical part. So like I said before, it's a working hypothesis, right? So we reflect a little bit, and then it seems like, helplessness and power towards parents might be a thing, might be a theme. I personally, I like to leave it as that, at that. I'm not too interested to continue for hours to talk about that, and to relatively quickly come to a step of, okay, what would be a good kind of exercise or a good implementation for that? How about the next time when you interact with your parents, you say things like that, or you prepare yourself before going to meet them, as you might do in a difficult meeting, as you might do with a difficult presentation that comes up, that you bring yourself into a mental space before that, that makes it less likely that you behave in a dysfunctional way. You don't want to stutter when you do a presentation, right? So you bring yourself first into a mindset of comfort. You go through the material, you make sure that you're confident in what you're talking about, and then it's much more likely that you will do it well, right? So also in this example, before next time you speak with them, before next time you meet with them, put yourself into a mindset of how you want to appear. You want to appear more mature. You want to appear as more calm. How do you do that? How do you react when they trigger you and they poke you and they try to somehow kick you off with normal comments, right? Why don't you wear a hat? Don't you know how often you get a cold in winter? So I'm belittled as if I'm a child, and then I act out like a teenager, and then I'm upset, right? So we anticipate these things in a conversation. Maybe they take notes of the typical things that happen. And then the exercise is put yourself into this mindset, then visit your parents, and then see how it goes. Right? So the focus was not about figuring it out endlessly what the reality is, but to have a valid working hypothesis, to see if, and to check if this was indeed valid through a practical implementation, through an exercise. Then they come back from the visit, and if they like, they can reflect on it. They say, yes, actually, I felt much better with that. Or they might say, actually, it was the same thing. Yes, I was much more calm, and we changed the dynamic, but I still couldn't sleep for 3 days. So we have to reject the working hypothesis, start from scratch, and ask, okay, so let's start fresh. What else could it be?
Interesting. Okay. So that's how you work with the patients.
Yes.
And it's very much sort of, that Adlerian thing, but a little bit more with like analyzing the internal, analyzing and processing the emotions and really getting to the actual situation and not, the way the situation has manifested itself, right?
Because I think it's so important to understand when we come about understanding. So it's not understanding other people, understanding myself. For me, a lot of understanding myself is to understand what my actual needs are, what my actual wants are. And it's not that there is a kind of a peephole where I can look into myself. Unfortunately, that would be great.
Yeah,
but
that would be awesome.
Kind of to reverse engineer it in a way. Kind of, I observe my reactions to people and to situations. I see that I'm uncomfortable or dissatisfied with that. And then I try to bring the puzzle pieces together. So I assume there is a need in me, and I'm just not fully aware of it, and try to understand the things that don't make sense in my behavior and my feelings, and try to see how we can put together a big picture that makes sense. Again, on a working hypothesis level. So understanding myself or processing myself, to me, very often means to get a glimpse of and understand the big picture of my kind of complex structure of needs and wants. And once I know, ideally, again, not that knowing is kind of a crystal clear look inside and there is a message board that tells me exactly what I want, but I somehow intuit a little bit more through the conversations what is important to me. If it fits more right now to focus on my friendships and relationships or on my career, for example. And that is then my understanding. And when I act accordingly, I see if satisfaction comes out. Like, this is the outcome variable. If I hit the nail on the head and I found indeed, so I started with a working hypothesis, and let's say it's career, and then I put some effort into career, and then I see that, this is so gratifying. This is so satisfying to set up my business or to get to this management level or whatever it is, or just maybe to have some more income, because that was always something that bothered me. I grew up poor. and it's just so soothing to know that I have possibility and money available to me, then you know retroactively or retrospectively
Yeah.
that was the need. I was on the right track there. So I
Right.
changed, because of the working hypothesis, I changed my behavior, I tried it out, and the satisfaction tells me that was the right move.
Interesting. And is that the same process that you would recommend to your, like for listeners who don't have access to you or to a coach?
Yes. So when people don't have access to it, I would still recommend to have some outside perspective. The
Okay.
problem is, and here I want to give Adler some credit of the just
Mm-hmm.
moving on with things. We are often enough trapped in some sort of problem trance, which
Yeah.
means that we are so absorbed with our habitual way of thinking. And if it's negative, it sucks. The
Yeah.
solution might be right in front of me, and I'm still churning, the same thoughts, and I'm going back of how much I hurt when my girlfriend disrespected me in public, or
Yeah.
when my boss did this, or my neighbor said that. And so instead of kind of freeing myself and doing
Mm-hmm.
something that will be good for me, I'm so just wrapped up in those thoughts, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
someone from the outside to
No.
come and tell me, stop that bullshit, just go
Yeah.
out and have fun, just meet
Yeah.
other people, just do something different, just bring your girlfriend a bunch of flowers, or and then hug each other again, or something. That sometimes it, or often it needs an outer voice like this. So even if I'm not in therapy or in active personal coaching, I would still recommend for people who don't have this to simulate that. For example, with things that you like to do, to read books. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an outside perspective. So when I
Yeah.
read a book and I read a suggestion, and first it sounds weird, and then I continue kind of to think about it, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, interesting. That's a recommendation that I didn't know, or
Yeah.
I wouldn't think of myself. And then there's an interesting friction, and there might be
Mm-hmm.
something creative coming out of that. We have many kind of interesting
Right.
videos nowadays on YouTube. So books and videos would be,
Yeah.
I have no problems to recommend that as a
That makes.
substitute for kind of work with a
Mm-hmm.
person.
And I was thinking that sometimes people just like get stuck into that poor me or that bad person mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was talking about in the beginning of the part of our conversation, right? Like this person I know, she is, I think, 55, if not 58 or 60.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and 60 years old, she still blames her parents
Mm-hmm.
that they didn't raise her right, they didn't feed her right, they like hit her, they didn't give her proper education. From there, she's moved on to my husband was not right.
Yes.
The husband was bad. He did not treat me right. Hence, I am so unhappy. And this person is fairly successful in their career,
Mm.
make a lot of money, but they have tremendous capacity to like continue self-sabotaging. All their relationships are on and off, right? Like
Yes.
she's talking to her kids for 3 months now and showering them with all the gifts because she has all the money in the world,
Mm.
and then suddenly cutting it all off and taking all the kids. Like there's always like drama involved.
Yes. Yes.
um and she's unable to break out of that kind of um cycle. And some people, I think, like she's an extreme example, but to some degree I think we all do that with some one or another aspect of our life, right? Like
Yes.
um
So one
for
reminder in
me,
situations like these, or
yeah,
it's difficult to completely
yeah,
change or interrupt these kinds of processes, but one question that I can ask myself, or someone else should ask
mm-hmm,
me, is that what you want in your life? So you have, when you're 50, you maybe have 55, you have 30 years max to live, maybe 35,
yeah,
40 years, something like
yeah,
that. Is that how you want to spend the rest of your life? And it's rare that people would say yes, because they are unhappy. They don't
But
like.
in their defense, it's
Yes.
easier to it's easier to blame other people, and it's easier to like,
Yes, but
I
I'm
do
using a trick.
understand that.
I'm asking a question that
Yeah,
people would have a hard time to say yes. Is that how you want to
absolutely.
spend your life? I would bet 2%, only 2% of people would say yes. I'm actually happy
Hmm.
to look for revenge for the rest of my life and to blame my parents. It's just not a. I don't
Yeah,
like myself saying that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
immediately something comes into my mind. Oh yes, maybe I want something more healthy, or maybe I want to be happy.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
how? Like, what would that be? So this is a possibility for a kind of a wholesome way of thinking to at least sometimes interrupt my habitual ways. I know it's difficult.
Yeah. And it is a release, right? Like for me, I know like when I get into that bad person or poor me, emotionally, it's way more gratifying. There's some release that happens or some emotional like I don't know what to say, but it's just like, it feels better, right? Like the entire society is based on that bad person, right? Like the whole German society was that bad person,
But
the
what feels
Jews who
better?
took all
To
their
blame them?
jobs.
It feels
It
better
was
to
not
blame them or not to blame them?
no, I'm saying that like inherently as humans, we all end up doing this that bad person or poor me, right? Like
Yes.
this entire nationalism right now in America are all based on this.
Yeah.
Um, Poor us, we like immigrants come and take all our jobs, poor us, poor us,
Yes.
poor us.
Yes.
And that bad person, those bad immigrants, those bad Democrats who let these
Hmm.
people in. Um, the entire world society and history is based on all of this, um so maybe we'll never fix ourselves, right? Like it
Well,
is
I mean, we would
very
have
tough.
to. I'm sorry. We would have to look at the process of what it is, and I mean, a big part of that way of thinking is immaturity. It's a childlike way of thinking. When
Yeah.
children have a very simple logic and they have a very quick way of blaming situations or other people or circumstances. And this is often what we see. It's an immature or underdeveloped way of thinking, which then as a consequence has an underdeveloped or immature way of feeling, because our feelings, of course, are inherently connected with our convictions and thought patterns. And then out of that, you have an immature way of acting as a consequence.
It's actually very funny that you said that, because in Adler, this is where he talks about this concept as well. And
Mm.
I'll actually just um, read that exact lines word for word
Please.
that he said. And he's like, if you think I can't do X, Y, Z because I was abused by my parents, it's because this person's goal is to think that way. Their real goal is not getting better. Um, so uh, their real goal is just to, you know, stay inside. And in this scenario, he's talking about this person who always wants to stay in their room, doesn't never want to come out,
Mm.
um, and basically Adler says his real goal is not going out. He's creating anxiety and fear as his reasons to stay inside. So
Yes.
you create these emotions as your reasons. So the reasons come, or the emotions come because your goal is different. Your
Yeah.
goal is um, to not go out. And why he doesn't want to go out? So his parents will worry. So even as an adult, he's not going
Mm.
out. So his parents are worrying. So he can get all his parents' attention.
Yes.
And he says if he takes one step outside of the room, he becomes part of the faceless mask whom no one pays attention to. He'll end up average or less than average, and no one will take special care of him.
Yeah.
So it comes back into that kind of mentality. So it's funny that you said that, because in after this paragraph he does talk about you need to love yourself, and you need to stop expecting that the world will love you the way a normal mother will love you.
Mm.
And I say normal by saying like know, acknowledging that there are mothers who are very bad, but most mothers have this unconditional love towards you. So you can go murder someone and your mother will still love you, right? That's the image of the mother. My mother definitely is like that. So, and it's, the problems happen because we expect that the entire world will love us, and at some point we either develop the thinking that I need to now just demand all that kind of love from people. And what Adler says is to sort of change it, which is you have to learn to love yourself unconditionally, and you need to stop demanding attention from others and be self-reliant. And that's how you become, that's how you become happy. But the question again comes down to, you just decide and you do it, and that's his philosophy all about, is you can just choose to live a different life and have the courage. And we can, if you want, we can go into this right now, or should we do another podcast?
Maybe we have to do another one after all.
But that is one that I wanted to, like, sort of, that is the last, if that happens, that's the last one, or we can finish it today.
Well, so just for the information for the listeners, that was the second topic we wanted to get into, the kind of the love yourself. I suggest that we indeed have another conversation, but we make this topic, because this is something that I think actually for many people who struggle with themselves is an issue. They hear this thing, maybe they heard about meditation, maybe they heard about, I don't know, it's a thing that we hear about, like love yourself, respect yourself, take care of yourself, and so many different facets. We encounter these kind of messages, and there are many people who don't know what to make of it and how to do it. It sounds mysterious to them. It makes sense. Of course, it sounds great. And when people kind of say, you know what, yesterday I took a warm bath and I lit candles and I put nice music and I felt so great afterwards. And many people would listen to that and think, I would like that, but I would feel just stupid doing that. For me, it doesn't result in this great self-care. Yes, I can technically do that, but it doesn't change much for me. So how to do that? I seem to have a deficit. Certainly, I don't love myself. I'm very self-critical, in fact. It makes sense that my life would be better if I could feel better about myself, but I don't know how to bridge this gap between intellectual understanding and actually doing that or feeling that. So what I would like, or propose, that we have a conversation about that, and that the Adlerian perspective is just a small aspect. Maybe we can start with that, but we have a conversation about that independently. Is that okay?
That sounds good.
Great. So thank you, as usual, for this conversation, and thank you for, I think we went into a nice level of detail with this topic of processing myself, processing others. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation that we have.